Pakistan, whatever that exactly conceives itself to be? Or is it the Malaysian model of high-tech tiger economy pushing ahead into the modern world through science and technology? What is the model? Sincere Muslims in a variety of different places have very different views. That's sometimes hard for Westerners to get their heads around. But the reality is that although the core of Islam is the doctrine, one God, and a series of prophets, and the basic principles, the 5 pillars, and certain things to do with family life and social engagement and dietary rules and things that are considered to be the core, as you move out towards the more and more public, the reality is Muslims have more and more diverse opinions. Probably that's inevitable. In many ways I think it's probably a healthy thing, but it does make it very difficult for people to answer the question of, well, what out there is compatible with the way the West would like things to be done in the Muslim world, and what's incompatible. So you go to Afghanistan, where in southern parts of the country the female gender has almost been abolished, and you go over the border into Iran, and half of the people driving cars are women, and they have women ministers in the government, and 50% of surgeons in Tehran's hospitals are women, and despite the problems there, it's not like Afghanistan, but they both claim to be Islamic republics. The Taliban have a sincere view of the relationship between the sexes. The mullahs in Tehran have a sincere view, but it's really different. So what is the Islamic monolith that is or is not compatible with the West? The question can't actually be answered. What we do know is that different forms of Islamic religion have in the past and today continue to be compatible with many things that are important to most Westerners. There are cases of cooperation even between really conservative Islamist regimes and rulers and the West, who originally set up the Taliban, who originally set up Al-Qaeda. I recently met with an American diplomat who said first time he met Osama bin Laden was in a reception at the American ambassador's house in Islamabad. He remembered him being really tall, because they were buddies back then, the days of the jihad. That was a very close relationship, because Afghanistan was the soft underbelly of the Soviet Empire, and there were American, Saudi, Pakistani interest in supporting the guys who they're now bombing. General Zia, a close friend of the West, but the great innovator of the Islamization project, the introduction of Sharia public law in Pakistan, still very close to the West. Saudi Arabia, perhaps the most conservative Islamic regime, constitutionally, is one of the handful of Muslim countries that are absolutely axiomatically on the side of the United States, not just politically, but also economically. That they always consult with Washington when they're going to do something to the oil price. That they are extremely close to them in terms of educational and cultural cooperation. That they're even getting Americans to redesign the holy cities in Mecca and Medina. Very, very close relationship. But still, apparently, huge ideological differences. So again, the idea that politically the West can never get on with Islamist or conservative Islamic political orders just doesn't seem to be the case. Sometimes the West fights against them, sometimes it supports them. That's politics. So that's kind of by way of making the question sound very complicated. There are different sorts of Islam. There are different ways of being Western. Is there a way in which we can actually tackle the question and get something out of it? Well, I think that there are ways, and those ways, unsurprisingly, since Islam is ultimately a religion, are religious ways. What if we turn aside from the current ructions in the Islamic world over the correct relationship of religion and state, and look at the sacred core of the religion, and its sacred narrative, its sense of its place in history, and also its sense of its relationship to other religions, and see if we can actually come up with a generic set of attitudes and values that we can call Islamic, that we could then bring into conversation with what the West has historically been. Well, one imbalance there is that the Islamic world has not been through and has not wished for the process of massive secularization that certainly Western Europe has experienced in the last 2 centuries. The percentage of regular churchgoers in South Cambridgeshire, where I live, is about 4 or 5% now. A recent survey in Indonesia, which is certainly not one of the most conservative Muslim countries, found that 79% of the population prays 5 times a day. That's a big disparity. So when we try to bring them into conversation, there's always going to be that imbalance. That in the West, there is a historic rivalry between Enlightenment, secularity, and religion, which is, from a Muslim perspective, seems to have been substantially won on the street by secularity. In the Muslim world, there has also been that rivalry. By and large, in the second half of the 20th century, we could say religion kind of won. In the 50s and 60s, the post-independence regimes across the Muslim world were socialist, secular, or sometimes secular monarchical, with 1 or 2 small exceptions. And then the Iranian Revolution happened, and a lot of other Islamization things happened across the Islamic world, and today the societies are much more religious than they used to be. I remember in Cairo, my first visit there in 1979, you would occasionally see the hijab, but not often. Now you go even to an upscale shopping centre in wealthy parts of Cairo, where you see sort of educated kids who've studied at American University and the Cairo elite. Maybe 80% of the women are wearing hijab. So whatever else has happened, there has been a re-Islamization process in the Islamic world that hasn't happened equivalently in the Christian context in Europe. That's another incompatibility and another reason why we need to be careful before we draw facile parallels. Sometimes we speak about Europe as being Christendom, and it's not really clear whether in the great ages of faith churchmen looking at modern Britain would have regarded this as being any longer a substantively Christian society. One could argue that, but at least there would be an argument. In the Islamic world, you can tell Indonesia still a Muslim society, Palestine a Muslim society, Egypt a Muslim society. So that's another incompatibility, and in fact perhaps the biggest single challenge to the triumphant Western narrative of a history of the cosmos that begins with the Big Bang and then becomes interesting when life begins 1 billion years ago, and then becomes really interesting with Plato and Aristotle and Athens, and then in a single uninterrupted story leads up to the modern West, that the Islamic world is providing the single most significant challenge to that narrative. That the story of what matters is first amoeba, which leads up through process of evolution to George W. Bush, and that's obvious. And many people in the Muslim world are saying, no, we think things are more complicated. We think things are a lot more complicated. But the Islamic world, more than any other civilization, is making things more complicated. Unexpectedly, 50 years ago, nobody expected other cultures to be visible publicly. There's Hindu revival, there are forms of revivalism and Confucianism, but it's in the Islamic world that there is a substantial non-Western, sometimes anti-Western alternative. It's one of the big facts of our time. So let's look at what seems to be intrinsic, that seems to be driving this. Often Muslim difference is, as I indicated, reactive. In other words, it's driven by a sense of threat and a desire to be different. So Jack Straw says that he doesn't like his constituents to wear the niqab, and the next day half of the girls in Blackburn are covering their faces. That's the basis for a lot of religion these days. It's just a desire to express one's identity and one's rejection about the things that are said about one. But if we look at the essence, what do we find? The essence of Islam, as I said, is belief in the one true God. And it is the God of Abraham, the God of Moses, the God of Jacob, the God of Jesus, and the God of Ishmael. That's where it becomes different and interesting. On the face of it, it sounds like good news that the West, and particularly Europe, has as its biggest, most significant minority members of that religious community that, if you look at the Quran, seem to be the closest to the traditional default religion of Europe. It's an Abrahamic religion. It's monotheistic. It looks very similar in many ways, but nonetheless, metabolically, it's distinct. And many aspects of that distinctness are probably already familiar to you. The Muslim idea of the undifferentiated divine essence is, on most interpretations, not compatible with the usual Christian understanding of the triune, Trinitarian nature of God. That is a difference. the idea that God saves